In this section, I'm going to talk about the kind of copywriting that most people don't. This is copywriting for long-term growth. Most of the copywriting advice out there is all about getting quick sales, but it has very limited market opportunity. You're not going to make a ton of money doing that. Ultimately, you're going to have to invest in long-term growth. So let's see how to do that, and I'm going to give you the secrets that most people don't know. So to start, let's look at an example of what I feel is one of the best pieces of copywriting ever written, and it is the best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup. A lot of people have this stuck in their memories. A lot of people immediately think of it when they think about getting up in the morning, and they associate that with the Folgers brand. This is an excellent piece of copywriting that's designed for long-term growth, for long-term memory. Now let's analyze it. The best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup. Why is this so good? Well, let's start with the words waking up. One of the reasons this is so important is because it's a trigger. It's a trigger that prompts you to think of the brand and to think of the product category, which is coffee. It's also what you might call a category entry point. So it's something that happens that makes you enter or consider the product category. So waking up in the morning makes you think of getting a coffee, whether it's getting it from Starbucks, getting it in your house, or getting it from some other brand like Tim Hortons. Now, another thing to consider is we have the words up and we have the words cup. This is a form of rhyme. It's a form of poetry. What this helps do is make it easy to remember. You see this all the time with ancient scripts where when there was a culture of sharing things orally, they used rhyme and they used repetition to make things easy to remember because they weren't able to write things down. And here, Folgers is employing those same methods. So the other key thing that we have here in this headline is the word Folgers. And this is something a lot of copywriters miss, is the opportunity to put your brand name in the title. A lot of people don't do this. They don't put their brand name in the title because what they're really fixated on is what the consumer is interested in seeing. How do you create value for the consumer? But a huge part of marketing strategy is creating value for you, the company, creating value for the brand. So one of the reasons this is such a great example of copywriting designed to generate long-term growth is that it is excellent at being remembered. And that's the key thing with long-term growth. You need to be remembered. The reason is because most people are not in a buying mindset right now. Even for products that are bought fairly frequently, like Coca-Cola, consumers still only buy it once or twice per year. That's what a typical buyer does when they buy Coca-Cola. So the goal is really to get into people's minds, into their long-term memory, so that eventually when they do consider buying something, you're the first thought to come to mind. And that's what Folgers does an excellent job of doing. So let's take a look at the research here from McKinsey, and we're going to look at a general view of the consumer buying journey. And here's what it looks like. It starts with this green star here. This is what we call a trigger. It's some sort of an event that prompts people to think about buying something. Now, that might be something like a divorce. It might be something like waking up in the morning. It might be like driving to work. It may be that your baby has a dirty butt. Any sort of thing could be a trigger that prompts people to think of a solution, to buy something. So after the trigger, then they think about their initial consideration set. So this would be a set of brands that are in their minds and they associate it with the trigger. So really, that's what you're trying to do with long-term copywriting, is build an association between your brand and that trigger event so that you are immediately brought to mind when that trigger event happens in the future. Okay, so the next thing that happens is there's an active evaluation. This is when people actually go out and do research. And that doesn't always happen, especially for simple products they understand, like bubble gum or soda. They don't really do a lot of research most of the time. And then there's the moment of purchase. So that's going to be when they're actually at the store and they're looking at the on-shelf opportunities, or when they're searching on Google, perhaps, to buy something through e-commerce. Then there's the post-purchase experience. So did they enjoy using the product? And then hopefully there's a loyalty loop. But we know empirically from research that investment in loyalty programs are really not that effective, that loyalty is more of a natural thing that happens as a result of using your product. So stimulating loyalty is actually very difficult. But One thing you can really invest in is stimulating long-term consideration, and that is done by associating the trigger with your brand. Great copy makes people remember your brand in key buying situations. Here's the trigger, here's the buying situation, and then there's a thought, hey, maybe my brand could be considered because of this trigger, because of this buying situation. The other thing that great copy does is it links the brand to many buying scenarios, especially with large brands with large budgets. So there may be multiple buying scenarios. So for example, Starbucks might be associated with breakfast. It might be associated with the commute to work. It might be associated with lunch. It might be considered as an evening treat. It might be considered for food. It might be considered for drinks. It might be considered for cold drinks in the summer, hot drinks in the winter. All of those associations are designed to stimulate thoughts about the Starbucks brand. One of the key things to understand when you do long-term copywriting is really what those category entry points are, those things that prompt people to think about buying in the product category. And this is the key thing that's going to separate the top 1% of long-term copywriters from the bottom 99%. So what most people are trying to do when they do long-term copywriting is just sort of general brand awareness. Are people familiar with your brand? But in a lot of cases, what we see is people are very familiar with brands, but they don't necessarily know the context in which to think about those brands. And those brands don't come to mind when there's a buying situation. A good example of that would be Salesforce. Salesforce is very well known, but it doesn't come to mind for a lot of people in those key buying situations, those key consideration sets that Salesforce wants to be in. Now, in the consumer space, let's go through some examples. So here are some easy ways to identify what those category entry points are. It's by asking these questions: when, where, with whom or for whom, a how feeling, while, with what, or why. And I'm going to give you two examples of ads that I saw. This one I saw while I was on the SkyTrain commuting, and this one I saw while I was scrolling on Facebook. So if we take a look at this Facebook ad for Tropicana, we see the delicious juice of oranges, the feeling of sunshine on a cool, crisp day, and then we see the image that connects with this piece of copywriting, the feeling of sunshine on a cool, crisp day. We see some skiing gloves, some skiing goggles. It looks like it may be snow. And then the orange is depicted as though it were a ray of sunlight. So what are they trying to do here? What they're trying to do is they're trying to make you think of drinking orange juice, which is generally a cold drink, in the wintertime. So it's a when question. When in the wintertime, and you're thinking about having something, you're going to consider orange juice. So they're depicting it as sort of this almost like a warm feeling on a cold day, even though the drink itself may not necessarily be warm. Now, similarly, what we see here, and I would say it's probably not the most effective copywriting, but they're getting to the right point, which is an association between a rainy day and the Vessi brand. So associating things like your shoes getting wet, well, you're going to want some waterproof shoes. So Vancouver ranks in the top 10 rainiest cities in Canada, but we're number one in Ryan Reynolds' heart. The part I don't particularly like about this copywriting is the part where they're talking about Ryan Reynolds, because I think this is a distraction from the Vessi brand. They could have benefited more here by emphasizing the Vessi brand in the headline rather than the Ryan Reynolds brand, which I think is going to overpower the message. But the general strategy is right here. Let's associate rain, this context of having a problem associated with rain, and the Vessi brand, waterproof shoes. So let's go through some other examples to figure out what those category entry points are. So when, good example would be breakfast or breakfast time. Similarly to what we saw there with Folgers, right? As soon as you wake up, what are you thinking of? Where? Sitting on a couch. Well, maybe that's a context for eating Doritos or popcorn. With or for whom? So for example, when you go out with a friends. How feeling? Relaxation from stress. Maybe that's a cold drink. Maybe that's a warm drink. Maybe that's exercise. Maybe that's stretching. Maybe it's a meditation app. While having a drink when working. Could be a coffee, could be a Red Bull, could be juice, could be something else. With what? To have as a dessert. Maybe it's to have it as a dessert when you're drinking coffee, or to have it as a dessert on a special occasion, like a birthday cake. Why? To stay up late. Maybe that's doing something like taking some caffeine shots or some caffeine gum or an energy drink. These references, by the way, come from the book How Brands Grow Part 2. Excellent book talking about long-term growth with brands. Another example that we have here from Sternthal and Rucker is something like starting college. So there are key life events like starting college or moving away from your parents that are going to be a whole series of triggers for people to buy a whole bunch of different things. So it might be furniture for their apartment. It might be school supplies. It can be a whole plethora of things. So moving into the dorm is a key event where advertisers, copywriters really want to emphasize, because that's a point perhaps when people get new phone plans, they get new bank accounts, they get new credit cards, perhaps their first credit card. So there's going to be very, very strong copywriting associating that first day of college with all of these brands that need to be considered at that key juncture. Another example of copywriting that I found from Kodak was springtime is picture time. So perhaps springtime is an opportunity for amateur photographers, professional photographers to go out, spend more time outside taking photos. They want their brand associated with that key event. So that's what they've done here with the copywriting. A lot of people think the goal of copywriting is really about persuasion, convincing people about why you're different, why you're better. But when we're looking at long-term growth, often that's really not all that important. Positioning isn't as important as simply long-term memory. Are people remembering your brand? That's the ultimate goal. And often it's just as loose as associating your brand with the product category rather than getting very specific about the technicalities of why you're different from the competition. In fact, in the real world of competition, some of the most successful companies are fundamentally not different from one another. For example, Pepsi and Coke, basically the same product, but they're both highly successful despite the fact that they're not that differentiated. But the key thing is that both these brands dominate people's minds. They're in your long-term memory. So often what we have to do with generating long-term memory is really build that association with the category. And I'm going to give you a quote here, and it is, "Important information is transferred from short-term to long-term memory by a process of amplification that associates new and prior knowledge. One way information in long-term memory is organized is in terms of meaning. It is thought that meaning of a brand derives, in part, from its association with a category." This comes from the book Advertising Strategy, which I highly recommend if you are interested in this high-level planning and different options available to you when you start planning out copywriting. So what we see here is we have people's long-term memory, and within that, they're thinking of a category. So maybe it's something like coffee. And then when they think of the category, then they're going to think of the separate brands. They're going to think of Folgers. They're going to think of Starbucks. So you need to cement that association between the category and your brand in people's long-term memory. And this is something people miss. They get a little too in the weeds talking about why they're different. And then people are just like, well, what the heck are you even doing? What is your product? I don't understand what it is. I see this all the time in the software industry where people are talking about why they're different. They're talking about high-level benefits, and they neglect to say just basically what they do. They're a live chat program, for example. Marketers don't focus enough on simply associating their brands with the category. You can see I did this with an incredibly simple ad. All that I say is my brand name, Decker. I say marketing courses. I'm saying that's the category. You could even go broader than that and just say e-learning or online courses or distance education. And then I say where to buy the product, which is on Udemy. And then there's a picture of me. Incredibly, incredibly simple. Just solidifying that connection between the category and the brand, which is my personal brand. Long-term memory is your goal. Information is most accessible when it has been thought about extensively in association with other thoughts. So a lot of the time, advertisers are really trying to persuade people about something that's new or that's different about their product. But really, to get into people's long-term memory, you're not trying to convince them of anything new, really. You're just trying to connect your brand with their pre-existing opinions, their pre-existing thoughts, things that are already stored in their memory. That's how you get into long-term memory, not by fighting an uphill battle, but by connecting with things that they already connect with in their memory. More enduring memories are created when we try to relate information to past knowledge or experiences. So a good example of this is Corona, a beer company. They're associating their brand with Mexico, which in turn is associated with a trip to the beach, which in turn is associated with refreshing taste. So they're latching onto things and associations that people already have. Now, some key ways to do this. Repetition. So for example, repeating your brand name multiple times in the ad, repeating the ad over and over, being consistent with your branding, using humor. This is going to help embed and get attention in people's memories. And you can also use things like threats, which may be a little bit riskier, but given the right context, could be appropriate. Another key thing that people miss is they don't put the brand name in the headline. This is something you really need to emphasize, especially when you're doing something like long-term copywriting. So for example, if you're running an ad on Facebook and you plan to run it for a year and you plan to maximize reach, you can't track performance by looking at things like clicks because the research shows that clicks aren't actually associated with very much. You also can't just look at things like what people are engaging with because engagement metrics are not that useful. So really what you need to rely on is the assumption that people are going to remember it, which you're not always going to have the research to do. So let's look at some examples of ads that did this, solidifying the brand in long-term memory. A man feels good when he's insured in New England Mutual Life. Another example, BF Goodrich, first and tubeless, brings you the power tires for today's power cars. Once again, they're reserving a lot of precious real estate in the headline for these brand names, which in the first case here, New England Mutual Life, is 4 total words. So it's worth doing because that's what you need to do when you're trying to build a brand. So once again, here's an example where I put the brand in the headline. Decker, the marketer. Trying to create some rhyme there, some poetry, some getting people to think about my brand within the context of learning marketing. I'm also trying to peg it to my collaborator here, which is Udemy, a much bigger brand. This ad that I've written, it doesn't contain a lot of details because the goal is memory. It's not persuasion. It's not saying why I'm better. It's simply saying I'm a marketer and I'm on Udemy. So put your brand name in your headline. And to conclude, this is a quote from the famous copywriting John Caples from the book Making Ads Pay. You may say, but my client's name is not famous. Putting his name into headlines will add words without adding pulling power. Once again, the argument here is that the brand name doesn't create value for the customer. But the answer is that putting his name into headlines is a quick way to make him famous. And that's what you're trying to do with your brand. Make it famous and create value for the company, create value for the brand, create value for you, and put money in your pocket in the long term.